So we're still speaking about the difference between an Oved Hashem and an Eved Hashem. An Oved Hashem is one who is constantly serving God, and he constantly has to make the effort to serve God. That's the level of the Benoni, who has never fully transformed his evil inclination or his animal soul. It's still very much alive, and therefore he continuously has to control it and overcome it. And that's why he's a Oved Hashem. He's really a person who's serving God. While there is a level of Eved Hashem, one, right? One who is a servant of God, one who already has done the full mastery and the full transformation even of the animal soul. And that's the level of the tzaddik, what most of us will not be able to attain. Now, we spoke about the tzaddik, who's the Eved Hashem, the servant of God, not just a serving person who's serving God, but the servant has kind of reached that level of complete mastery, if not transformation of the animal soul, as mentioned. He has, as King David puts it, he has his heart that is empty. Libi halal b'kirbi. But we spoke about that emptiness, that it's not just empty, but it's actually filled with divinity. It's like halal. We said the Hebrew word does not just mean empty, it also means universe. Just like the universe may seem empty, but it is filled with stars and planets and so on. So to hear his heart is filled with divinity, as opposed to the Oved Hashem, the person who is a Benoni, who has that animal soul that still occupies his heart, even though he is able to fully master it, and not transform it. Still, it still speaks to him, but he's still able to control it. Okay, let's continue here. As you said, Margot, bottom of page 46, the difference between a worker and a servant. Again, an Oved Hashem and an Eved Hashem. A worker or someone who's serving God, and someone who's a servant of God. Here is an analogy, or at least a depiction. Does anyone want to read?
I'll read.
Please.
I'll
Please.
read. Okay.
Yeah.
The difference between a worker and a servant can illustrate this. For the hours that a worker is active, he is called a worker. The moment he stops, he ceases to be a worker. A servant, on the other hand, need not be active in order to be called a servant. His entire identity is bound up with his service. A king, as well, does not have to do anything in particular to be titled a king. He is the king because he already has that standing. In this sense, the tzaddik is not one who is serving. He has completed that phase of struggle. Now he can be called a servant of God. His position regarding the service of God is static. Though he may not have attained perfection, he has closed a chapter of his life. Those challenges no longer exist for him.
Right. And by the way, what this also implies is that the Eved Hashem, the servant of God, who has that title, is someone, therefore, that is a servant of God even when he sleeps, even during his, downtime, as they call it. Not that he has any downtimes, but even during the times that may seem more mundane, when he eats, when he walks, he's always an Eved Hashem. And that is because not just of the title, but because of his demeanor, the way he comports himself, the way he thinks, the way he speaks, the way he acts, even when he sleeps. They used to say among Hasidim that you can tell who's a Chassid in a dorm. Most yeshivas have dorms, but you can tell who's a Chassid in a dorm while people are sleeping by the way they sleep. Now, there are practical laws about how to sleep. For example, one should fall asleep on his left side, not on his right side. And, Hasidim go as far as even wearing a kippah while sleeping or whatever. But it's also the demeanor. You can tell by the dreams that a person has, by, again, the way a person sleeps, whether he is an Eved Hashem or just Oved. Only while he's actively working on it, then he's connected to Hashem. How about when he sleeps? Maybe not. But Eved Hashem is a whole different level. Even during the most mundane activities, he's still that Eved Hashem, or he's still the king, as is the analogy. Now, just to be practical, we can somewhat achieve that level too. Even if you consider yourself just an Eved Hashem, which is already a big consideration, and not an Oved Hashem. But by turning the mundane activities of life into holy ones, that's how we can have that title all the time. So, for example, when you walk in the street and you think of thoughts that are holy, then you become an Eved Hashem. You might stop working on your service of Hashem, and then you say, well, I'm just walking, I'm just taking a jog, But if you are still thinking of God during those moments, then you've earned that title. And when you're eating, and you're eating in a proper way, and you control yourself what you eat, and you're saying the blessings of the food, etc., that's when you can also earn that title. So we can achieve that in many ways by turning the mundane into holy. And when we sleep too, and again, during all these other mundane activities. In fact, it says that when Mashiach will come, that the world will speak to us. We want to be the speaking species. That's what we're called in Kabbalah. Only human beings are speaking species. Animals don't have that, even though they might make all sorts of noises, but they don't speak, they don't say words. We're the only ones who can speak. When Mashiach will come, the whole world will become one big speaking species. Animals will talk, stones will talk. And when we'll be walking on a stone, on asphalt, doesn't matter where, on tiles, and we won't have holy thoughts, we won't have good thoughts, the tiles or the rocks themselves will tell us, hey, you have no right to walk on me. With the thoughts that you have right now, I'm better than you. So you have no right to walk on me. So just being cognizant of that can turn us into Eved Hashem. We can start earning that title when we transform the mundane into holy, because that's really what the world, not just God, but the world, the materials of this world expect of us. Anyway, but the Eved Hashem again has that all the time. When a tzaddik walks, I can guarantee you he thinks of only holy things. When he sleeps, he dreams of only holy dreams. Or at least he comports himself in a holy way. When he eats, the same thing. During all of his mundane activities, he's an Eved Hashem. We can at least strive and do everything in our power to attain that 75% of the time, maybe. Okay. I'd love to hear more comments and disagreements and so on. Otherwise, we'll continue here with developing this idea even more. Okay, let's continue. Page 47. When a youngster learns.
When a youngster learns the multiplication tables, he activates his conceptual thinking time and again. How much is 6 times 7? How much is 7 times 8? Over time, though, he no longer has to drill himself in these exercises. The challenges cease being challenges. His efforts are unconscious. When learning to read or to master a new language, the student repeatedly practices forming letters and writing words. Yet the student reaches a point at which these matters are no longer an issue, when ideas modulate into language without confusion. So too, a tzaddik service of God. His exertions are past history, and the battleground between good and evil is quiet.
Right. Maybe just one more paragraph, because it's important to note this. This does
It
not mean...
does not mean that tzaddikim do not grow and advance. On the contrary, they have no rest, neither in this world nor in the next. They forge ahead constantly. With nothing evil left to combat, the field is wide open and infinite to move ahead in Torah and the commandments and to progress in their knowledge of God.
Right. So the difference here mainly between Beinonim and Tzaddikim, again, the one serving God and the servant of God, is mainly in this, that the one who is a servant of God has worked on himself so much that it has become his default nature. God has become his default nature. Him and God are one. So what he thinks is what God thinks. What he says is what God says. What he does is what God wants him to do. The one serving God is still separate from God. Yes, he's connected with God. Don't get me wrong, that's why he's serving God. But he still has to exercise and exhaust himself in order to connect. Doesn't come to him naturally. It's not his default nature, like it is for an adult when it comes to 2 plus 2, 8 times 7, or the other, become a part of him because he's exercised it so much. Same here with the servant of God. Now, doesn't mean, and that's why I said it's an important paragraph here, doesn't mean that the tzaddik doesn't need to grow and advance, even though his default nature is God. But he has different types of work. And I would say that those works are divided into two categories. Category number one is from one level of good to another level of good. So now he says blessings over food. Let's just take that activity. Or he thinks holy thoughts when he's walking on the street, as we gave as an example. But these holy thoughts continue to grow in their holiness or in their depth. Or the blessings that he says continue to grow also in their depth, in their intention. So he's doing it. It's his default nature. But now he has to grow from level to level, from good to better, from holy to holier. That's one category. Another category, which is really maybe the most differentiating category between the work of a tzaddik and the work of a Benoni, or the work of a servant of God and the work of one serving God, is that because a person is serving God, the Benoni constantly has to work on himself. So naturally, he has to focus on himself because he has to make sure that he's in check all the time, that he's in tune all the time. So he's focusing on himself. The tzaddik, on the other hand, because he's turned his default self into a godly self, he doesn't really need to work on himself anymore. It's, as we said, it's his nature now. So now his main focus is on the other, on the world altogether. So he's growing not so much in his own self, because again, he's achieved that, he's a servant of God, but he's growing in bettering the world. The tzaddik's main focus is the world, because himself doesn't need that focus anymore. He's a servant of God. So these are two areas in which there's great difference between a servant of God and the one serving God. One serving God, again, has to fight between the animal soul and the godly soul. Obviously, he's always picking the godly soul, but he still has an animal soul. While the tzaddik is fighting between one level of goodness to another level of goodness. And again, the one serving God has to fight between focus on the self, which is very important for him because he has to refine himself constantly, and still serving the world, while the tzaddik can dedicate all of his efforts to serving the world because his self is already complete, so to speak, the servant of God. So the tzaddikim still have a lot of work, and they have much more work too. That's why it says that tzaddikim enam menucha lo ba'olam hazeh v'lo ba'olam haba, that they have no rest, not in this world and not in the world to come, because they have the whole world to take care of. In fact, it even says that if the tzaddikim would rest even for 1 second, this world could not sustain itself. And this is not just speaking about the righteous of this world, speaking about the righteous of the next world. That the world couldn't sustain itself without their prayers, their doings. So they have a lot of work, much more work maybe than a Benoni, because the Benoni still has to find himself and he can't devote all that time and all that effort. But it's a different type of work. That's the servant of God. Now, most people, let's also clarify, can't really reach that level. As we've said, most people are born to be Beinonis, not tzaddikim, or people serving God, not servants of God. But we can still learn from them and even imitate them in many different ways. Okay, we can continue. Otherwise, please open up. I shouldn't be the only one talking. Okay, let's continue. A child must be taught.
A child must be taught what to eat and what to avoid. Left to his own devices, he would be omnivorous. An adult need not be told to avoid harmful things. Lack of discernment is not an issue because these already discussed him. Similarly, a tzaddik chooses good and shuns evil. Just as the thought of eating something dangerous would never occur to a normal person, so too a tzaddik chooses the good and would never entertain a base thought. The likelihood that he will gossip or commit any other wrongdoing is as remote as a member of our culture dining on tainted food. Though immune to performing a transgression consciously and intentionally, the tzaddik is liable to fall prey to mistakes. If he is unaware of the evil nature of something, he is liable to stumble. Yet, just as one finds people everywhere who sense instinctively what is inappropriate, so it is with tzaddikim when it comes to the boundaries of good and evil, holy and impure. They have an innate, almost visceral withdrawal reflex protecting them from error.
Right. So it's interesting because, if you think about this, every human being has red lines. Everyone has red lines. Even murderers, even rapists, even the worst of the worst have red lines. For some murderers, for example, they would murder other people, but not their own family. That's a red line for them. Or every human being, even the scums of the earth, have red lines. The question is, where are your red lines? That's the question every human being should ask himself. What are my red lines? Now, for the tzaddik, it's very clear what his red lines are. His red lines are what God doesn't want him to do. How do we know that? In the Torah, God tells us what to do, what not to do. And not just the letter of the law, but also the intention of the law. That becomes his red lines. And the intention he connects to with his holy intuition, like Rabbi Steinsaltz writes about here. Those are his red lines. And they become almost instincts. He knows almost automatically that, okay, I can't cross that. And the more we have God's red lines, both practically and intuitively, the more we are in the domain of the tzaddik. Not that we can always entirely attain that domain, but the more we enter that domain, at least the energy of that domain, so to speak. And that's what this is saying. So a child has to be taught what to eat, but an adult already knows what's good for him, what's not. That's his red lines. The child has to be taught the red lines. And an adult knows that either both practically and also intuitively. So too with the tzaddik when it comes to God's red lines. And I think if we want to attain that, we can start drawing our own red lines in life based on what God's red lines are. Not just practically, but also, again, intuitively, asking, what does God want of me now? And those are the red lines we should all have. Now, many people have other red lines, or they don't have red lines at all in certain areas. But really, the goal is to have God's red lines. That's how I like to call them, at least. Let's go to this story. There's a very powerful story here. There's two stories. Let's just make this point again with these stories.
Two stories portray this. Rabbi Yitzchak Meir of Gur, the founder of the Gur Hasidim and a great scholar, never ate any meat if anyone had raised any kind of question of kashrut over it. Even if a rabbi had judged the meat to be kosher, Rabbi Yitzchak Meir would still avoid it because there had been an uncertainty. On one occasion, he was served meat and would not touch it. The cook was interrogated. There had been a mistake, and there was a halachic question concerning the animal, although it was thoroughly kosher. The Hasidim were stunned. How did the rabbi know? They asked. What are you surprised about? He replied. Anyone is capable of reaching this level. Simply, if he accepts this condition, that if something forbidden were to touch his lips, he would choke on it. He would never make an error.
Right. So again, that's where the intuition of the tzaddik comes about. Here's another one, which is similar. Another story.
Another story is told of Reb Shmuel Munkes, a disciple of the author of the Tanya. The Hasidim once brought a pot of appetizing food to the Farbrengen, an informal gathering of Hasidim with refreshments and words of Torah, and were eager to start eating. But Reb Shmuel kept them away from the pot once, twice, and finally threw it out the window. Meanwhile, the cook sent word that the food was in fact not kosher. On hearing this, Hasidim, who were known for their outstanding service of God, seized Reb Shmuel and prepared to beat him up for the offense of openly displaying divine inspiration. Reb Shmuel explained, "Divine inspiration? What are you talking about? When I saw everyone's eyes light up with desire, I knew the dish was not from the side of holiness, but from the side of the klipa."
Right? And sometimes that's how you know how that divine intuition works. Because if you are fueled by just lust towards a dish here, that means that the dish itself must have something wrong because it's activating the animal soul instead of the divine soul. So Rabbi Shmuel intuitively knew that. And he said that dish, there must be something wrong in this dish because it's activating the worst side of the human being, not the best side of the human being. And lo and behold, that dish turned out to be not kosher. So in many ways, that's a measuring stick, a barometer, so to speak, that you can tell what is God's red line, even sometimes it's not clear, just by asking yourself, what is this area that I'm focused on? What is this issue activating? If it's activating my animal soul, I guess it shouldn't be a part of my life. That's where I should draw the red line. If it's activating my godly soul, then I should welcome it. It should be within my boundaries, not outside of my boundaries. And that's how you can start also refining your intuition by asking those deeper questions. What is this situation activating? That's what Reb Shmuel did in this story. Just quite powerful because again, Reb Shmuel had that immediate divine feeling, not just gut feeling, but divine feeling. Didn't know that the dish was not kosher, but he had the intuition, and that kept him away from crossing the red line of God and not eating what eventually became clear as a non-kosher dish. Just want to make one more point here, and that is that both Reb Shmuel and Reb Yitzchak Meir in both stories here were people of tremendous holiness because they worked on themselves so much. It's not like they were born like that. The stories are quite astounding. Yitzchak Meir, by the way, became one of the great Gerer Rebbes, Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Alter. He was known as the Chidushei Harim because of the books that he wrote. But he was also known as very, very pious, but of someone who worked on himself tediously. And so did Reb Shmuel Munkus. He would spend hours and hours in meditation and pray. He would pray for 7 hours straight, almost every day. So it's not like, oh, wow, I'll never get to that level. Well, if you exhaust yourself like they did, maybe you will. So it's intuition that is worked on. And it's red lines that become clearer and clearer as we work on that divine soul, on that service of God.